This is a screencast of my Smart Notebook lesson. The topic chosen for the Smart Notebook lesson is determining the plot of a story with the specific goals of how do the protagonist and antagonist interact to create the plot of a story, and how can I remix characters across mediums. This lesson was designed with 3 standards in mind. First, the Common Core State Standards, specifically Grade 5, 5.3, compare and contrast 2 or more characters, settings, or events in a story or drama, drawing on specific details in the text, e.g. how characters interact. Additionally, in the 21st Century Standards, on page 13, students will define, prioritize, and complete tasks without direct oversight, and monitor one's own understanding and learning needs. So the initiative and self-direction. And then lastly, the ISTE standards, number 6, creative communicators, specifically 6B, students create original works or responsibly repurpose or remix digital resources into new creations. This is a 5th grade lesson plan focusing in English and language arts literary text. So the lesson begins with the first essential question: how do the protagonist and antagonist interact to create the plot of the story? With the featured picture of 2 lions facing off against each other, representing the conflict that exists between the protagonist and antagonist, and how that conflict is the driving force between all parts of a plot of a story. So the first pre-assessment is just to make sure that the vocabulary used, that all students understand it. So the plot element pretest looks like this. Now what students are asked to do is to look at each one of these key vocabulary words that will be used throughout the lesson, such as protagonist, antagonist, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, and then match them with their correct definition. So protagonist would of course be the good character, antagonist is the bad character, conflict is the problem or issue the protagonist deals with, rising action is the first major event after the conflict, climax would be the point at which things get worse or better, that turning point, falling action is the first major event after the climax, and then resolution is how the conflict is solved or left unsolved. So that of course would be a perfect score because those are the correct answers for the plot element pretest. So after completing the plot element pretest, the teacher would be able to ascertain whether the students are okay with this vocabulary or need some extra practice, because as the teacher communicates instruction, he or she would want to know that the students and he or she are able to use that common language and that everybody understands each other. So after that, to build some of the prior knowledge needed for the protagonist and antagonist discussion, 2 videos would be viewed. So the first, and I'll just show a preview of both. I'm not going to film both of the videos, but again, so a preview of who the protagonist is by Schmoop.
Who is the protagonist? A la Schmoop. Books are populated with millions of different characters, from kind-hearted recluses to monsters stitched together from dead body parts. Chances are, if you can imagine him or her, that character exists somewhere out there in the literary verse. Despite their diversity, most of these characters can be filtered into a variety of tried-and-true roles. The most popular role, by far, is the protagonist.
Okay, so students would view that and then discuss things they noticed or things that stood out about the discussion of protagonist. And then, of course, the next one is who is the antagonist.
Who is the antagonist? A la Schmoop. Every good book needs conflict, whether it's a showdown with the scariest, most evil wizard of all time, or the heroine trying to decide who to take to the big names. It takes at least 2 to tango, or to duel. And conflict just wouldn't be conflict without an antagonist.
So again, the discussion would be, what did the students notice about the antagonist? The teacher would also be careful to explain that an antagonist is not only another person, it can sometimes be an animal or inanimate object, nature, society, a people group, or the protagonist itself. So representing the different types of conflict that can exist within a story, versus self, character versus society or a group, character versus nature, or a character versus another character. So after that, students would read The Three Little Pigs within their small group. And they're going to take notes about the two characters, the Big Bad Wolf and Brick Pig. So this is the text. It's the original story of The Three Little Pigs. This is chosen because, one, it's good to expose students to that kind of the historical document, so seeing what the writing was like at that time. But also because the story changes a little bit with the pig that made his house out of bricks killing and eating the wolf. So it's definitely a different story. It's not as sanitized as some of the versions that students read today. So it'll be a new kind of retelling of a story that they're all used to, and a story that has a very clear antagonist and protagonist, and a story in which each event is clearly pushed forward or influenced by those two characters. So after the timer goes off, students will then just compare and contrast those two characters. So using this Venn diagram, characters or students would see, what is different between the two characters of the Big Bad Wolf and Brick Pig, and then what is similar between the two of them. So then based on that information, based on that conversation, students would then be able to discuss who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. And then after discussing, the teacher would bring back the class and then reveal the protagonist is the Brick Pig, and the antagonist is the Big Bad Wolf. So then students are going to go back into the text and do a close reread of page 1 from There Was an Old Sow till paragraph 7, ending with Ate Up the Little Pig. And what they're going to do is they're going to highlight and determine in their group the conflict of the story. So the lesson is trying to let the students lead the learning, the teacher taking on more of a facilitator role, and that the students are able to direct their learning and struggle through the rigor of the assignment on their own first before the teacher then, fixes any misconceptions or addresses any misunderstandings or confirms that the students were correct. So students would then, look through that part of the story and then determine the conflict. Following that, the class would come back for a discussion as what role did the Brick Pig play in the conflict, and then what role did the Big Bad Wolf play in the conflict. Okay, the same pattern will be continued for the rising action. Again, seeing what role each character played. And then with the climax, with the falling action, and with the resolution. Just a note about the timer. The timer was included to, make sure the lesson keeps progressing, to also give the students like a clear set time that they need to discuss in. The timer can be adjusted by the teacher, so if the teacher is seeing that the kids need more time, it's on there so it can be adjusted easily, and if the kids need less time, same thing. But that's just to ensure that the lesson keeps moving, that the pacing keeps going, and that it gives the students a concrete time and within which to work. So then we move on to the summative performance task. So this is how the students are going to demonstrate their understanding. And they're going to do this in a project that they're going to be managing themselves. So going back to that 21st century standard. And then also remixing the material. So going back to the ISTE standard. So they're going to be creating a podcast. They're going to use characters from The Three Little Pigs or another classic fairy tale covered in class. So it was imagined that students may have also read the original Little Red Riding Hood, which in the end of that, the wolf eats Little Red Riding Hood, and that's it, because it was written to warn little girls to not talk to grown men. Again, showing that kind of historical perspective to students. Or the original Cinderella, which ends with the stepsisters being punished for their vanity by having their eyes plucked out. So again, it creates a retelling of a story for the students, exposes them to some historical perspectives, and because of the inclusion of violence, sometimes makes it more interesting for the students. So they'll be using the characters from one of those stories of the Three Little Pigs, and they're going to create a host and a program for the two characters to be interviewed on. So, they would generate this, whatever the program would be called, and kind of what the program's goal would be. They would generate a host, and then they're going to write a script with questions and responses from two of the characters. So, questions from the host, and then both characters should be responding, whether they're being interviewed together or being interviewed separately. And then after reading through that script, they're going to record the podcast. And then they're going to add production elements to their podcast, such as an introduction song, a signal for a transition for commercial break, as well as including one sponsor for your program. So with this, a podcast is limited by the technology available to a school. So this is definitely an assignment that could be adapted and done in kind of like a mock podcast format where students would just perform all of this live. If the school does have the ability to record, all you need is a microphone, or even on your phone, you can take note, you can record your voice. So most students have phones, or the teacher has a phone, schools have iPads. All those things can be used to record the podcast. But I just want to make sure that it definitely is an assignment that can be adapted to the technology available to the teacher. So then the podcast would be evaluated using this rubric. So inclusion of characters, that they included the characters that they needed in the host. Anything additional, right, would be scoring as advanced. Meats is, a quality product. So it's not just because it's the meats that it's, this is like a C. This is, would be an A. This would be a quality product. And then approaching would be something that's missing from it. So show contents, right? The host and the characters engage in 5 back and forth each, so that there's some depth to their conversations, so that the host will ask the character 5 questions, and then the character will answer back 5 times. And they do that for each character, so that at least to give the students a number to work towards. Definitely some students are going to go above that, but wanted to provide students with the minimum to meet in that podcast assignment. Then the production element, right? So that the show included an introduction song. It could be a song that already exists. So if students took the liberty of creating their own song, that would be considered advanced. So using just sort of a song that already exists, could be counted as the introduction song, much like a lot of radio programs or podcasts use existing songs today. Then the transition. So to signal the transition from, the talk to the commercial break and then back, students need some sort of sound to transition, to show that they're transitioning between the different parts of their show. This could just be something spoken. This could be a sound. This could be a song, just anything that represents a transition. And then if students were to introduce more, right, if they were to create like separate segments that they introduce, or they were able to include other sounds, like a clapping, or, like an oh, ah kind of sound, just something that adds to the listening experience, that would be advanced. And then their sponsor. So if it's already in existence product that kind of relates to their story, that's a fine sponsor. But then if students wanted to take it a little bit extra and create something individual or create something unique and new, that would definitely be advanced. And then the sound quality. So if the sound quality is great, that's perfect. If it's inaudible or the quality is uneven, that's something we want to avoid. But if they introduced a lot of creative elements and still had that high sound quality, that would be advanced. So this is the rubric that would be used to assess the podcast assignment, making sure that the students are demonstrating their understanding, but also demonstrating their ability to remix these characters and remix the text into a new format. So as a guide for the teachers, I attached this teacher's guide to podcast. This is also a place where students can see examples. So it has the kind of why steps, what should you include, how to get started. So here's some audio samples that students can listen to. Okay, just to give you a sample.
I feel like I should read this how the white people read it on the radio. Okay. So, this is Allison Neely, and this is my embarrassing story. So here we go.
Okay, so there's lots of different examples for the teachers to use to share with the students, to other projects they could use. So this is not only for the teachers, but it also is to give samples for the students to be able to hear kind of what does a podcast sound like, how do we speak on a podcast, what are some of the elements to include. So that is the notebook lesson. Again, it was based on those 3 standards to not only teach students how to analyze a story, but also to take that analysis and remix it into something new and creative that they're managing themselves to kind of hit all those standards.